pay attention in particular to the questions I'm going to ask you as I get to these prepared remarks. You may not need to answer them immediately, but they're important questions. So this conversation that's happening is occurring in a time of extreme grief, anger, and exhaustion, and just possibly through the protest and sustained action, a time of hope. So across this nation, across this state, this region, there have been important conversations about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a movement meant to unite Black, Indigenous, people of color, and their allies in the work for liberation and justice. Here's my first question for the audience. Have you come today to join the Black Lives Matter movement? Hold on to that question. This may be the first time for some of you to talk, where you're talking out loud about that infamous four-letter word, race. So before we get down to sharing our perspectives and identifying a course of action, let's be clear about one thing: words matter. And so there's been general conversation by all kinds of actors defining the terms of systemic and institutional and structural racism. Now, those terms are frequently used, but may be less widely understood and applied. So what I want you to think about is I want you to envision 246 years of slavery, another 89 years of apartheid, and pull that forward to 1954, the Civil Rights Act, and punctuate that, and I'm going to bring a health perspective in 1972. Our nation was still involved in a experiment on Black men, syphilis experiment called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Now, if you haven't heard about that, this reference may not fit well for you, but the point I want to make is in 1972, we were still acting in overtly racist ways at a deep institutional or structural level, our government. So dial forward to where we are today. And I offer that as an example, a soft but specific example of institutional structural racism. It's racism that's sort of built into the fabric of our society. So hold on to that. I've now talked about interpersonal racism, or intrapersonal racism. Those definitions will show up when Laura convenes a second or third conversation on this matter. The other point I wanted to make is you must understand that you are either racist or anti-racist. There is no middle ground. So on this issue of race in America, there is no fence sitting. And so I would ask my next question, and then this is a question for you. How can I remain neutral or uncommitted about injustice, oppression, and modern day lynching like the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that have become the symbol of police brutality? I didn't even have to use George Floyd's name there, and you knew who I was talking about. Now, that last question was really a rhetorical question. You really only have one choice. You cannot remain neutral. The question that I'm going to ask you to hold on to and to use today in following this conversation is, where am I? And you may want to repeat this to yourself as I ask it. Where am I on the continuum to becoming anti-racist? How do I model anti-racist actions for others? And let me go back to that first question. Where am I on the continuum to becoming anti-racist? Again, the backhand comment here is, you're all racist. So where do you sit on that continuum? So those are the questions that I wanted to use as a setup for the panelists and for your participation with the panelists and in small groups. The structure that we're going to use is I will have the panelists come forward. They'll be responding to a question. Our other panelists, we have an opportunity to ask that panelist questions to clarify, to deepen their exploration. And we'll do that kind of round robin with panelists through the end, and then we'll break to small groups. I'd ask folks to chat liberally as we go through this process, and we'll pull some of your questions out of the chat assuming we have time in the process to do that. So with that, I'm going to ask you to hold on to your questions. Place yourself on the continuum by the end of this day or end of next week or at some point in your life, but you do have a current placement nonetheless. So we're going to go first with Yves Salomon-Fernandez from Greenfield Community College. And Yves, I'm going to ask you to respond to why do we have to talk about race at work? Why is it so difficult?
Oh, are we answering that, or are we doing the question first?
Well, why don't we pause on that, and if you want to do the question first, go right ahead.
Okay. There's a survey that just came up. Are we doing the survey now? I don't know, maybe it's just my screen, but I'm seeing a survey now.
I'm seeing a survey as well.
Okay, sounds good.
Sorry, Frank. So everybody, we've got just a really quick poll before we launch into the panel for you all to take. So we're just going to give you about 20 seconds to go ahead and complete this. There's 3 questions. So have you witnessed racist acts in the workplace? Have you witnessed anti-racist acts in the workplace? Many workplaces have diversity and inclusion departments. Are you clear about the difference between diversity, inclusion, equality, and equity? And as soon as everybody's finished, we will share the results so that you can see those in real time. Okay, looks like almost everybody's voted. 2/3 of you have voted. And we're going to close it now. So just really quickly, 86% of you said you've witnessed racist acts in the workplace. 11% are saying no, and a few were unsure. On question 2, 81% have witnessed anti-racist acts in the workplace. 10% said no, and about 10% said I'm not sure. And then on the last question about the differences between diversity, inclusion, equality, and equity, 67% have a yes, 11% no, and about 22% I'm not sure. So thank you all for taking that, and we'll go back over, and you'll see on your screen just the bios of our panelists.
Okay, so I think I can go back to the question now.
Yes. Please.
Okay, I think, so racism is an issue that we confront, no matter what your race or color is, we all confront it at work. And of course, we know that Black people, when you look at the history of the country, historically and also contemporary history, we see that the levels of wealth for Black families versus white families in this country and in this state are very disproportionate. I recall a study that the Federal Reserve Bank here in Boston did, where they looked at the levels of wealth of white families in the greater Boston area versus Black families, and what they came up with was something like for every $100 that a white family owns has as a level of wealth, a Black family has $5 to that. And when they looked at Latinx families, the level of wealth was actually negative. So we know that career opportunities provide ways for families to build not just wealth for the current generation, but to also build wealth for the future generation. And when you couple that with higher education, which is my field, it can be very transformative. So if racism is prevalent across the board in workplaces, it can not only prevent families from being able to build wealth, to build financial security, which in turn allows them to engage civically. A family that is concerned about putting food on the table, paying for the rent, for instance, will have limited opportunities to engage as civic members in the community. So when we look at the impact of racism in the workplace, it is one that carries implications at the individual level, but also at the family and community level. So I want to thank Laura for convening this panel and for engaging in this conversation today, because most of us are associated with the Leadership Pioneer Valley Institution because we have had some interaction either for professional development, or we are fellows, we are graduates, or we send people to that. And so this conversation today is particularly important for us to open our eyes to what the implications of the individual or institutional and system-wide actions that we take, what they have. And again, in my field of higher education, it's something, and at Greenfield Community College, it's something that we've begun, that we began to look at several years ago, but we are redoubling our efforts, especially in this time, convening conversations with students, with faculty and staff of color to ask them what their experiences are, and also to look at across the organization, where do we have opportunities for upward mobility and opportunities for professional development, and also opportunities for our colleagues of color to be able to talk about their experiences, both in a confidential manner and also openly with our white colleagues. And one of the things that I always say is it's important to have to make the extra effort to ensure that we have a diverse pool of candidates, but it's also equally important to make sure that our colleagues are ready to accept, to work with, and people of color, Black people specifically, and folks who are at equal level of authority and at higher levels of authority. And how do we recognize some of the issues and some of the challenges that folks might run into? And increasingly what we are hearing is that there are issues at the micro level. So microaggressions, as we've heard from our colleagues across the board, which is also very consistent with the research on workplace racism, is where we really need to put some effort. And equally, we've also been talking to students to hear from students what are the ways that we can be anti-racist. So our students have been very clear that they want the curriculum to be an anti-racist curriculum, and we have a couple of groups on campus, one that is a racial justice group, and another one that is a leading change working group that is part of a broader statewide group that is examining how across our curricula, how across our policies, our practices, we can adopt more anti-racist stances. And also we can continue to examine our data consistently to ensure that we have not just more equitable outcomes, but also more equitable opportunities for students. And particularly important here is the role of social capital, because we know that the kinds of social capital that our students of color bring, they bring a lot of resilience, they bring a lot of grit, they bring a lot of know-how building informal networks. But in terms of going into the workplace, they may not have, especially if they are first generation, long established relationships with businesses, with other professionals. They may not know the wider range of opportunities and career pathways that are available to them. So now, as we are meeting with donors specifically who want to set up scholarships, as we are seeing people are interested in doing that, what we want to tell them to do is, I had a donor yesterday with whom I spoke, and she said, well, I want students.
Can I interrupt you just a second? Because
yes,
we're really running these like 5-minute clips, and I want to bring Kimberly into this conversation because she has a workplace framework that actually, I think, builds on some of the comments you're making. But we want
fantastic.
We want to be sure we get some additional voices in here. So let me
fantastic.
Transition you to Kimberly. Kimberly Williams, who is a VP at Stanley Black and Decker, Diversity and Inclusion, will offer a workplace perspective.
Yes. And please do cut me off. I set my timer for 5 minutes, but I can go on a tear, as many of you may know. So the question I was asked to address really is the distinction between diversity and inclusion and equity. And I think this answer very quickly is for about 20% of you based on that poll. So many of you either know what the difference is or are kind of unsure. So I will use a kind of tried and true D&I descriptor or explanation around the difference. So diversity is acknowledging diversity is being invited to the party, right? So you invite different people. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Now I'm different, I'm in this party, and now somebody is engaging me and inviting me to dance. And if we go further into equity, I would say equity is being able to bring my own playlist to the party, right? And so it's recognizing that we may want or need something that's different than others at that party. So those of you in the healthcare environment, it's similar to that platinum rule versus the golden rule. So the golden rule we've all heard is do unto others as you would want others to do unto you. That's inclusion, so to speak. The platinum rule is do unto others as they would like to have done unto them, and that's the platinum rule. And there's an important distinction between those. Another example I'll give for any of you who might be basketball fans, some of you have seen the NBA slam dunk contest. You can give me a shout out, a hand raise, a thumbs up using your reactions if you know what I'm talking about. So I am probably 5'1" on a good day, right? And so I've been invited, though, to participate in this NBA slam dunk contest. I'm excited, I've been working out, I'm ready to go, bring it on. Now my opponent is, say, 7'1". I know there are plenty of them in the NBA. Now, no matter how hard I work out, no matter how prepared I am physically and emotionally for this slam dunk contest, there's probably very little chance that I'm going to beat my component who is 7'1", unless I'm a superhero. And sometimes we expect that of people of color, that they will be able to compete. We set them up in a dynamic where the possibility of fair competition is like this, and it's just not possible. So equity is creating a situation with my opponent where we're about here, right? And so maybe that means I have a ladder, maybe that means he's shooting from his knees, whatever has to happen to get us on a relatively equal playing field. That's equity. And I think the difficulty in most business settings, discomfort around equity, and the reason inclusion seems easier is because we feel like, hey, it feels good to include other people. It feels good to kind of feel like we're all part of the same team and we're, we're rowing in the same direction, and this is how we get work done. It doesn't necessarily feel good when we feel like we're doing something that gives someone an unequal advantage. So the question earlier was, what's the difference? I don't necessarily believe in equality because, particularly when we talk about race and racism and equity in general, there's always in our current system, in any country that has been part of any type of slave trade, so going back 600 years, there's bound to be an inequity, an inequality of race. So there's no such thing as equality in the workplace. but people, we're kind of ingrained in this and baptized in this idea of the meritocracy. So we all advance at the pace of our effort. If we all put in the effort, then we can all advance at equal pace. If I work harder, I might get someplace faster than you. If you're not working as hard, you're invariably going to be behind me. So we live in this fallacy, and that's what makes equity uncomfortable and difficult in a lot of work environments, because what equity requires us to do is to say that person or those people need a different level of consideration. We need to do something that balances that bar out, and that's what equity is about. So that means I might have to have a different set of opportunities. That means I might have to you might have to look at my candidacy in a different way in terms of being hired or promoted. So that's the kind of distinction that I see and why it's difficult. So that's my 5-minute mark. I'm happy to elaborate further in our breakout, but there's a huge difference, and it's a difference that needs to be attended to in a business and a corporate setting. We got to get uncomfortable with the idea that there's no such thing as a meritocracy.
Great, Kim. So we're close to getting back to our timeline that we've established for ourselves. We really want to be sure that we reserve adequate time in the breakout groups for folks. So I'm going to not ask the other panelists to respond at this point, but I'm going to ask Josh Miller to join us in this conversation. Josh and I go back a long ways. I haven't seen Josh in ages, so I'm really looking forward to hearing from him. So Josh, what are some examples, ways that we can get comfortable with being uncomfortable in this conversation? I think you're muted, Josh.
Okay, I fell into the old Zoom trap, muting myself. But thank you, Frank, and it's great to see you and to see everybody else who's here right now. So I was originally asked to talk about two things. One was how to be a white ally in the struggle against racism, and then I was asked to talk about ways that white people can feel, can become more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I just want to say that these are very related questions. I want to preface my remarks by saying also that my goal is to put these questions in a historical and structural context. And I also want to say that I don't assume anything about anyone attending today's workshop, nor do I exempt myself as a white person from anything that I will say about white people. I'm part of this. So what I'm going to speak about is what I hope white people will consider, because I'm a white person who's been working against racism with colleagues of all races for many years, but I particularly talk to white people. I only have 5 minutes, and I want to say something quickly about history. Everybody at this symposium knows about the social contract that came out when we founded this country. All people are considered equal, have unalienable rights, etc. And we all aspire to a country that has that. But we're living in a nation that was founded on a racial contract that defined who was fully human and who's not. And Harvard historian Joe Lepore has written that between 1500 and 1800, 2.5 million white people emigrated to what is now the US, forcibly bringing 12 million enslaved Africans and killing 50 million indigenous people. Also, recent historical scholarship has really focused on how enslaved African Americans working in the cotton industry helped create the industrial wealth that has made the United States the powerful, wealthy country that it is. And the reason I'm bringing that up is basically to say that all white people who live here have benefited from that unpaid labor, whenever it is that our families came over to this country. So what I'm saying is that white supremacy and racism were baked into the DNA of this country and continue to be made manifest by a web of institutional, structural racism, which Yves and Kimberly have alluded to. And I think I want to say is that most white people are unaffected by it and unaware of it. It's seen by most white people as being, quote, normal, whether it's living in predominantly white neighborhoods, having access to better schools, not being pulled over for driving while white. not having to represent our race when in classes or at meetings, having mostly white chief executives, lawyers, engineers, so forth as examples. So all of this, in my view, is internalized by everyone. It's the map of the world that forms our inner way of understanding and how we respond to what is inside of us. So it's not about whether a white person is a good person or doesn't see color when they see people and treats everyone the same. It's about how we are all part of a historical and structural context that elevates white people, and what can we do about that? And that's what I want to quickly finish out with. So what can white people do about this? And I'm going to assume that everyone attending this presentation agrees that we should do something about this, and it will make for a better nation and for people of all races living in this nation to do this. So number one, I think white people have to make a commitment to work on this personally, organizationally, voluntarily, in the community. And I want to stress this has to be a long-term commitment. There's no quick fix. And starting to work on organizational racism, for example, and then abandoning it after a year or two, that actually is more harmful than not taking on the commitment in the first place. Secondly, I think white people have to engage in personal work. We have to learn more about history, about how structural racism is manifested. We have to raise our consciousness about racism. But we also have to reflect on our internalized beliefs, our assumptions, our stereotypes. Everybody has them. The key is not to push them away, but to examine them and reflect on them. And part of this analysis, I think, for white people involves not rushing to try and fix things, which many white people, well-intentioned, try to do. There has to be a deeper understanding, not only cognitively, but also emotionally. We have to stay with the pain. And three, that leads to learning to be comfortable with discomfort, or learning at least to live with it. Racism divides and alienates people from one another. And acknowledging racism, understanding racism, talking about racism, it can leave white people with many feelings: guilt, shame, anger, etc. We can't let those feelings shut us down and lead to withdrawal or defensiveness. Inevitably, there will be mistakes. There may be criticism, confrontations. This is all part of the process of confronting racism. And I guess, getting back to something that Frank asked, none of us can afford to be bystanders in the struggle against racism. Number four, we need to work together in coalitions. But I think white people need to be particularly careful about usurping leadership, often inadvertently and with good intentions. People of color understand racism from the inside, and white people have a lot to learn from their leadership in the struggle against racism. And my last point, part of the struggle for white people is to understand what it means to be white, how white privilege and white supremacy is manifested, internalized, and it's sometimes in very subtle ways. So as white people do this, it can be very painful for people of color to be a part of this. So I guess what I want to say is I think there's a place for white affinity and support groups that focus on things like unlearning racism, understanding white privilege, being a good ally. So I'm just going to conclude by saying, ultimately, dismantling racism, it's liberating for everyone. It's something we can all engage with personally, at home, in the workplace, in our communities, in our families. For the sake of this country and the world, we all need to be part of this struggle. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Great presentation. And Josh really provided us a great understanding of structural racism with a very concrete historical context. So thanks for that, Josh. Yemisi, how are you doing? My teammate, Yemisi is gonna bring to us some insights around ways that HR and business leaders can support and hold an organization accountable.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Good to see you, and thank you, esteemed panelists. Got to see your daughter, see your face in her face. Hi, and thank you for all your comments, Joshua and Yves. As one of the pieces that I kept nodding my head was the constant reference of structural racism. And so when we talk about structural racism, I want to talk about structural inclusion. as they laid out that historically the racist legacy of the United States is that the structures were built with racist intention, inequity. So what does an organization does? How can they make that change? Well, I want to reflect on the McKinsey report that talked about diversity and inclusion and how companies who actually have it as part of their strategy have more innovative products, actually have improved financial gains, and diversity of thought and improvement of the way that they think and do their work compared to companies that are uniformed. The reason why I bring that up is companies, Harvard Business Review or Dr. Frank Dobbins did a research around why diversity doesn't work. Why diversity doesn't work? Because we've been so focused on behavioral inclusion practices. Oh, let's do this training, and all of a sudden your bias goes away. All of a sudden the system becomes equitable. All of a sudden policies are equitable and you're an anti-racist and all of those things. Well, where has it lead us today? We're in 2020 and we still see the fabric of the inequities within structure. What D&I has moved towards is data, as was mentioned in the previous. But in order to do that, if something is built racist, you need to deconstruct and bring it down to create equity, hence structural inclusion. So Dr. Robinson and Baystate, he's a part of that. At Baystate Health, we started what is called a structural inclusion committee. The structural inclusion committee looks at policies, practices, algorithms. How are we selecting our people? How are we sourcing? We need to look at what's the structure that's built inequitably, dismantling it, and creating equity in the process. And when you do that in conjunction, behavioral inclusion, then you do the training, then you do all those aspects. You can't have one without the other. So my suggestion is, and I hope my internet has been really bad today, so hopefully you can hear me. My suggestion is for organizations is to really create a cross-functional approach by having a committed, dedicated group of people who will literally dissect the organizational structure and looking at what are the things that we're doing that creates inequity. How are we promoting? Is there a ceiling? We talk about glass. A lot of corporations have brick cement ceilings that we need to pummel through. Okay, we need to take a proactive look at really deconstructing what has been built, then adding behavioral inclusion into the practice, and also incentivizing in some ways, holding leadership accountable. And there's various ways in doing so. Looking at how you source and recruit. One of the things that I've heard is that when we're looking for, it's breaking out, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So Yemisi, I think we're probably going to have to move your move you into small groups, and so and sort of continue that dialogue. Yeah. The one point that Yemisi made that I want to sort of restate, that this notion of structural inclusion and the design within Baystate that she's leading, that she has a cross-functional team, a cross-sector team of organizations trying to dismantle the baked-in systemic institutional barriers that are bigger than the bias of any individual, but they're recurrent patterns of discrimination, of exclusion. And so by design and with the use of data, Yemisi is leading an initiative to reframe and reorganize, redesign pathways to equity for all employees. So it's a powerful piece of work, and I'm sorry that the voice did not come through in a way that you all could benefit from it. We may actually simply do a whole panel with Yemisi all by herself around structural inclusion. But we have a few minutes, and I want to offer an opportunity for our panelists to ask one of your panelists an additional clarifying question or add a comment that will clarify what you've heard from them. So I'm going to give the panelists a couple of minutes to do that, and then we're going to move this to the next step. So panelists, I'm going to let you guys unmute and sort of step in on your own.
I have a quick one to follow up with what Yemisi was saying, and I was trying to scroll through my email to find it really quickly, and if I find it, I'll put it in the chat box. But I recently read a blog that talked about how to be successful in this work, and it identified 3 areas of focus. One, what are the priorities? Set some priorities and focus there. The other is thinking about what systems have to be changed. So what do you have to change in your organization systemically? And then the third kind of a leg on the stool is how do you change habits and behavior? So your approach has to include those 2 areas, systems and habits, and has to be kind of based on what you've identified as a core set of priorities. And I just thought that that was a really good, simple roadmap. And again, if I find the link, I'll put it in the chat. It's a very short blog, but again, I thought it was a useful way of thinking about the work.
Great. So that's something that we might adopt at Baystate and other places, building on the foundation work that's begun there around structural inclusion. So thanks, Kim. How about other panelists? Questions for each other or an observation you want to lift up?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Laura.
So, especially among my corporate friends, I see so many companies rushing out with statements about how great they are on racism right now. How do we make sure they actually have plans and are doing the work instead of just doing what we call in environmental, the greenwashing? So I guess this is, I won't use I can't find a euphemism for that or a metaphor, but you know what I mean.
So panelists, that's a good challenge. How do we hold organizations accountable for this work? That it's not all rhetoric, but it's in fact something that's happening on the ground.
I think I always like to say, if it's important, you measure it and you also align your resources to fund it. So I think often we relegate D&I activities to be something that stands on its own. I think, yes, it needs to stand on its own, but it also needs to be integrated across the key performance indicators of an institution. And there also has to be a budget assigned to it that aligns our articulated and espoused institutional values with our institutional actions.
Fantastic upgrade. So let's measure it. Let's be sure it's funded. There's a budget. And then I would add, let's assign value to it by making it part of management's compensation.
Yeah, and Laura, I would say that
Absolutely.
this, I'm sorry, yes, I mean, go ahead. I was gonna say that this is a really great way that social media can come into play. So all of these, or many of these statements that CEOs made, they made them on their corporate social media channels. And I know that that's, people listen internally to what's being said and how people are reacting to those channels. And so our CEO made not a "here's what we're doing, we're so great" statement, but a statement of solidarity and kind of setting some expectations. And many people, current employees, previous employees, consumers have challenged our organization on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and said, "What are you doing? Prove it to me, show it to me." And so all of that feedback is coming back to our executives, it's coming back to him, because our communications team monitor those channels like minute to minute. So I would say, you know, that's one really way that you can leverage social media. Push back, ask for those people who've made those statements to be accountable, ask how they're doing it, you know, make sure that you're calling for them to come back, you know, a month later, 2 months later, 6 months later, and say exactly what they've done to stand in solidarity. So I think from an external perspective, that's one way to do it. And I think that employees have this opportunity to do the same thing. What are we doing? Prove it to me, show it to me.
Great, great. Fantastic. Thanks for the upgrade. So Yemisi, I think you were trying to get in with a comment. So I think you're going to have the last word. We're right at the time.
I think Kimberly already stated it's about holding organizations accountable. Hopefully you could hear me. I'm sorry.
You're good now. You're good.
Dr. Kerouac obviously sent the vaccine to racism, and that was really used a lot, especially during this time with COVID and racial injustice. And also the transparency. You need, one thing, as Kim mentioned, social media, I mean, when they really hold your feet to the fire, the constituents really state what needs to be done and how it needs to be done and how it impacts them. And also internally, it's not just external factors, it's even those that are working internally. And also at the same time, also know that people in this work, it is a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. And you don't know all the barriers, all the structural things, all the process to move from point A to point B to point C to point D. So take that into consideration, because the racist legacy didn't happen overnight. It's hundreds of years. And so to eradicate that, it's going to take a lot of time and a concerted effort of every one of us to do the work.
So I think we're right on time, on schedule. I'm gonna pass this back to Laura, and she's going to move us to groups. So let me just sort of restate with my closing comments. Have you come today to join the Black Lives Matter movement? Big question. First question I asked you. I'm asking you again, how can I remain neutral or uncommitted about injustice, oppression, and modern day lynching, like the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that have become symbol for police brutality? And where am I on the continuum of being an anti-racist, and how do I model anti-racist actions for others? I think we've gotten a bit of insight into each of those big questions, or at least you've gotten some data that you can use in answering those questions for yourself. So I'm moving out of this moderator role, and I'm going to join the groups and continue my dialogue. Laura, I'm passing this back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. And I want to thank the panel for going so deep with us and really looking at some of the history and the structure here and not shying away from it. I've been on too many things where, the diversity stuff is really the fluff part. And I really appreciate all of your honesty and not blinking in this moment. So what we're going to do now is move into small groups. You all have been pre-assigned mostly randomly, and you'll have 30 minutes with your facilitator. So we ask that once you move into your small conversations, we will repost the community norms, and we ask you to follow those norms. We ask you to turn on your video if you've turned it off, so that you can see each other and be actually, well, this is Zoom and it's weird, but trying to have a face-to-face conversation so you can see each other's reactions. Especially these conversations, I think it's really important to see people's faces and reactions when we can. So we will do that. We will type the questions that you have to consider, and then our facilitators are going to be taking some notes that we can send out to folks later. We're just creating a really big Google Doc. Please note that they are maintaining confidentiality, so anything that you say won't be attributed to you in the notes. It's just some of the key takeaway points from your conversation. So you're going to be in this group talking about, one, the question is, in what ways do you think anti-racism is an important to someone in your role in the workplace that you're in? The second question and you might not get to both of these because you're going to have about 8, 9 people in your groups, but what actions do you want to take? How do you want to walk away from here? I appreciate Josh saying this is a long journey. This is not like I'm just going to pick this up because I saw the Sprite ad recently. We have to be in this for a long haul, and we can all take first steps. So what steps do you want to take? And what are the obstacles that are going to be in your way? I hear so much from leaders like, I'm not a decision maker, so what can I do? Let's peel that back together. So I am excited to have you talk to each other, and hopefully I can push the right buttons and make that happen. So give me 1 second to do that. Okay. Oh, and it's not telling me that I can add all rooms. Give me 1 second. Oh, all right. This totally didn't work. I preset the rooms and they're not preset. So we're just gonna start adding you guys, and it will work out. Okay. Best laid plans, folks. I'm sorry about that.
I'm confident that Dr. Robinson could just continue to facilitate a panel discussion.
Who said that?
Tony?
Tony Hendricks. Thank you, Tony. I appreciate your endorsement of my skills. So if you guys would like to do some question and answer of our panelists as they do the background work, I think, thank you, Tony. I think I'm going to take you up on that offer. Or we might find that we get moved out in the middle of a conversation. But does anyone in the audience have a question that they want to pose? Step in, pose your question. And Tony, I'm gonna call on Tony since it was her great idea. Is there something you want to ask a panelist or the panel in general?
So thanks for putting me back on the spot, Frank. I am interested in hearing from the panelists about what they have seen that works during this time. You know, what have your companies or your institutions or your organizations already done that we could walk away today and say, this is proven and it works, and we could implement this or something like it at our companies.
Okay, what's working? What's the shovel-ready D&I or anti-racism project that Tony can pick up and implement?
Well, not just me, but everybody. 80 people on this call. We could all.
Yemisi's going to offer something.
Yes, and thank you, Calvin, for wanting me to restate, and I think it will help because I know it was choppy. Although Dr. Robinson did a good job because he's leading with me on that committee. And so one of the things that you can do is, and I know there was some questions around recruitment, and I don't know what organization you have or what organization you work in, but really analyzing your data. Looking at your policies, looking at your practices, looking at your recruitment, how are you promoting, and using what is called intersectional analysis. Because oftentimes when we look at D&I, we put, I've seen different kind of measurements where they put everybody that's diverse into a bucket and it looks good. Oh, you got 26% diverse people in the organization, but what positions do they hold? That's, what level? Are they middle management? Are they professionals? Or their frontline staff? What is the promotion rates of Black employees, Black females, you know, the intersection, or Black females who are in their 30s, a different generation, is to really start and uncover and looking at your data. And usually the first step that is easiest, that's, I'm not saying it's easy, but people tend to look at their staffing models and their teams, their leadership makeup. Research shows the more diverse the leadership, the more diverse the organization. And so, and more opportunities for creating pathways for going up. And that's what structural inclusion, which I was trying to say, deals with, is really uncovering and looking at the baseline. What is my baseline? And so someone asked about recruitment. You know, I've seen some of the mistakes is, oh, we have one diverse candidate in the pool. That's tokenism. And then what happens is that individual, and I've had this conversation with Dr. Robinson, has to deal with the fact that they were chosen possibly because they were Black and not because they're the best candidate for the role. So if you have a position, particularly in leadership, you got 6 candidates, 3 should be diverse, 3 not. You need to include the pool. That's equity, not tokenism of, oh my gosh, and a lot of companies are trying to do that this time during this era of racial justice. They're trying to fast track and bring someone into a position. And to the point that I believe Kim mentioned, what is the environment, or Yves, coming into? What is the environment coming into? So we really, really need to take a data approach to your work and creating structures. And that's something that you can start today. And I have a document that I could share that shows the steps around structural inclusion.
Great. Yemisi, you have made up for your lost ground earlier. This is being recorded, so anyone that missed the earlier portion, they now get the full Yemisi. So thank you very much.
Still are on. Yes, we're all coming back.
I just want to say goodbye to my old group. I know we were cut off. Good talking to all of you.
Thanks, Calvin.
Thank you for everybody who's in my group who shared.
Also, I didn't get a chance to tell my group how excited I was for the dialogue, and I really appreciated their openness and honesty.
Yeah, my group had really rich conversations, took a lot of notes. So thank you everyone for really chiming in and contributing.
Yep, and thank you to my group as well. And Sam, I'm sorry you got cut off.
This is Kim Robinson. Thank you to my group as well. I really enjoyed the conversation and would love to find a way to continue it. Thank you.
And I already signed my group because I was watching the time.
I'm Kim Robinson as well, so I was confused. I was just like, wait, who's that?
It's funny because in my Brady Bunch, you two are next to each other. So welcome back, everybody. I know even though it was a half an hour, it wasn't enough time, right?
Right.
Yes. So before we end, and I've got just a little bit of music to take us out. First, I just want to see if I could get 2 comments from different rooms, just anything that you want to lift up for the whole group. So you can raise your hand or just unmute and go. So I got Willette.
Okay, we had a fabulous conversation, and I think all of us agreed that we'd like to at some point continue it. There are a lot of highlights which I will put into the Google, but one of the things we ended on was race fatigue. And we talked about how people of color simply sometimes get tired of having to explain and dance around and make excuses and conform. And so that's something that I would like to really explore more going forward, race relations and race fatigue.
The conversation in my group was phenomenal. So I thank you for the folks that I was assigned. But there were 2 quotes that really stuck with me, and they'll probably resonate with me for a while. One was, "We don't realize how racist we are." And the other is I'm exercising my heart and brain.
Thank you so much. I was trying to type it in and listen at the same time, and I'm not a very good multitasker, as most of us are not as well. I would ask everybody to please, we will be sending out an evaluation that you will receive at the end of this, but if you want to put in the chat box just something positive, a plus that you got out of today's session, and if there's anything you want to change, you can throw it in there, or you can wait for the evaluation. But if you put it in the box, then other folks see it. I want to also let you know that Yemisi called back in using the phone, and while you were all in breakout rooms, she gave her presentation again, so it will be in the recording. So if you want to fast forward past anything and go straight to Yemisi, you can do that, or watch it again, but we'll have that on there so that you'll have it. There's been a question about contact information. So when you get your follow-up from us, we're going to provide some resources that we've compiled through the Healing Racism Institute, and then one of our facilitators also gave a really great resource list. But when we send that out, we'll ask you if you want to be included in the contact list or not. If you don't want to be included, that's fine. But if you do, we'll make sure that the contact list for this session is included. If there are things that you like in the chat and want to remember the things in the chat box, if you look to the lower right corner of the chat box, there's 3 little dots. If you click on that, you can actually save the chat, and it will save it to your computer. So that way, any of those resources, you don't have to worry about remembering them. When I do the follow-up, I will also send you the bios of our great panel, so you know who they were, because I knew it flashed on the screen very quickly.
Right.
And then the other things that I want to mention, Vanessa Otero from the Healing Racism Institute had to leave early, so she sends her welcome and thank you to everybody for participating. We want you all to know about the 2-day training that they do. It is a tremendous resource for our region, so something that you can participate in. I'm not sure on the virtual what their schedule is for the coming year, but we can make that known to you. We will have a follow-up to this conversation, so we'll let you know about that soon. We just haven't scheduled it yet. None of us are going on vacation, right? We're just working through it.
Not going to Florida.
Just
Laura,
Florida, Massachusetts. That's all I'm going. And Dr.
Laura,
Robinson.
I'm chair of the board for Healing Racism Institute for Pino Valley. Willette online is one of our facilitators. There is going to be a modified schedule beginning in the fall. We think we're going to be able to do some modified face-to-face, so we're not quite sure what that will look like. So stay tuned. Since you have the email address from everybody that's on this chat, we will automatically include them in that upcoming event plus subsequent events. So just stay tuned.
Great, thank you. And I've got some music to take us out. So one of my favorite groups that I've been privileged to see, I think they sum it up. I might have done this wrong. Give me 1 second to start over. There we
Well,
go.
while you're doing that, Laura, I wanted to recognize 2 giants that left, and particularly Rep. John Lewis. I think it's important as we continue this work, and just to reflect on as we are dealing with 2 pandemics. COVID woke up America, and racial injustice unveiled America. And so we need to not put the veil back on. We need to continue this work. And I love what Ms. Willette Johnson stated about race fatigue. That is real. And that is something we're bringing to Baystate in order to provide support for our Black employees, Black and brown or BIPOC employees particularly. And so it's important that we offer education, training, support, but also work on rebuilding those structures. We have an opportunity here to really create something equitably and great in our organizations.
Thank you so much, Yemisi. Really great points.
Will breathe and rest. You believe in freedom, cannot rest until it comes. We'll believe in freedom, cannot rest. Hear me talking to you. We'll believe in freedom, cannot